Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, hoki mai, ki tēnei kauhau, mai iti te rongapai o maka. Greetings to you one and all. Welcome back to our ongoing presentations on the Gospel of Mark. We're loving this series. There's been some really great reflections and material put out there, and hopefully today I'll add to that. I'm Buckshot, part of the Wellington chapter of God Squad, and it's a joy to be part of this series and sharing these reflections with you. My first run with God Squad was back in 1989, and in 1990 two of us here from Wellington went over to spend the weekend, a long weekend with the Melbourne chapter, and we went on a run to a rock concert out in country Victoria. And on the Sunday morning, in one of the tents that we had set up, Smithy did we had a little church service sort of thing, and Smithy's sermon, his talk, his homily, was on the text that we have to discuss today. We're up to chapter 5 in our journey through Mark. So we're looking at verses 1 to 20. So I've got another really long story to speak about. Lucky for me, it's one of my favourite, if not favourite, gospel stories. But it will take me a wee while to get to the end of this talk. So hang in there. Sorry about that, but hopefully it's worth the journey. So Smithy introduced me and a whole load of us actually to these ideas way back then. And a few years later, about 5 years later, 6 years later maybe, when the first New Zealand members of God Squad were presented with our patches, Smithy again chose to speak on this text on that weekend as part of our formation, as a way of outlining the what, why, where, and how that God Squad engages with the world. So I've reflected on this particular text for over 30 years now and continue to find deeper and more challenging facets as I do. Other commentators have helped me dig deeper into the vein of rich material that Smithy first broke open for me. As with any story, context and location are critically important. Jesus struck out on the road a while ago, beginning in Galilee and ending up having to retreat to the wilderness and lakeside. Last week we heard from Sean how he crossed the lake in the boat that he'd been using as a pulpit. It set sail for the other side. And what do you know? Of course, a storm blew up. Another idea I was introduced to earlier in my God Squad journey was that where we stand determines what we see. Understanding our location and what we know is vitally important if we are to engage seriously with the world around us. Now that crossing of the lake was from the Jewish side of the lake to a place called the Gerasenes. This new location is a fascinating area. It is a Gentile or non-Jewish region. Scholars tell us there was a Roman garrison based there, and it was most likely the eastern outpost of their empire. Apparently it was also a place where returned soldiers, veterans, were given land to live on in honour of their military service for Rome. If Jesus has been breaking the religious rules already in his attempt to bring about the kingdom of God, in this text he is doing it on steroids. This is the beginning of a new section in the ongoing story that Mark is telling. So far the scenes have all been set in Jewish locations. This new location is now used by Mark in the next few chapters, starting with our exorcism in the graveyard that revisits the themes of that first exorcism in the Capernaum synagogue. In the Jewish context, Jesus took on the ruling class of scribes. Now he turns his attention to the colonial power of Rome and what they are doing in that Middle Eastern location. So we are very much on the other side now. Let's hear the story beginning at Mark 5 verse 1. They reached the territory of the Gerasenes on the other side of the lake, and when they disembarked, a man with an unclean spirit at once came out from the tombs towards him. The man lived in the tombs, and no one could secure him any more, even with a chain, because he had been secured with fetters and chains, but had snapped the chains and broken the fetters. And no one had the strength to control him. All night and all day, among the tombs and in the mountains, he would howl and gash himself with stones. Catching sight of Jesus from a distance, he ran up and fell at his feet and shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, do not torture me." For Jesus had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked, "What is your name?" He answered, "My name is Legion, for there are many of us." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the district. Now on the mountainside there was a great herd of pigs feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us to the pigs, let us go into them." So he gave them leave. With that, the unclean spirits came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd of about 2,000 pigs charged down the cliff and into the lake, and they were drowned. Now that's a pretty dramatic account that needs some serious investigation to even scratch the surface of the possibilities. First, Gerasene is about 50 kilometres from the lakeside, so Mark has taken a bit of poetic license here. He is placing the story in the wider Hellenistic region that he also calls the Decapolis in a few verses' time. Mark is seriously placing this story in a very clear and definite Gentile, non-Jewish context amongst the Roman military machine. As well as the new cultural and social context, Jesus is embarking on a religious rule-breaking campaign beyond a Pharisee's wildest fears. Our demoniac legion is living in tombs and beside the pigs. He is also cutting himself, which was a practice forbidden in Levitical law. Herod Antipas had recently built a city nearby called Tiberias, which was on an ancient graveyard, and he had to coerce Jews to come and live there. They viewed it as an unclean place that they did not want to be. Yet here is Jesus, taking his mates on a cross-cultural journey to this, the other side of the lake, the unclean and impure location where no respectable Jew would want to be, let alone a rabbi, a religious leader. The language of our demon is also Hellenistic. His words to describe Jesus are not what the Jewish demon used in the Capernaum synagogue. Again, we find Jesus first silencing the demon, because to be named by someone was in a sense to be owned by them, and of course Jesus did not want to be owned by that guy. He manages to get the man to give him his name though by asking, "What is your name? Who are you?" A very humanizing way to engage with a distressed person. His name, of course, is Legion, and this can only mean one thing at that time in Mark's social world. Just remember that Mark was writing in Rome when Nero was the emperor. A legion, of course, is a division of Roman soldiers, and the rest of our story today is packed with military imagery. Even the herd of pigs is a military nod. Pigs don't move in herds, but bands of military recruits were often called a herd back then. Giving them leave was another military term, and then the way the pigs charged into the lake could be compared to a legion of troops charging into battle and on to their demise in the pursuit of an empire's ambition to control land. It is almost certain then that our friend Legion was a returned veteran, living in an area gifted to him as a returned serviceman in recognition of his service for the empire. He must have been traumatized by his service to be living like he was. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, you will be familiar with the character Lieutenant Dan, and I wonder if maybe he is a good modern caricature or image of what our man Legion may have been like. The location of our story in this region, with real legions based at the nearby Gasin, and most likely they were the owner of the pigs, gives this episode specific political meaning. So far, Mark has taken on the Jewish establishment. Now he is eyeing up the colonial Roman settler occupiers of Palestine and the Middle East in that day. It is interesting that Legion begs to remain in that area. He is pleading to be able to maintain his dominance in that place. Jesus, though, obviously has other ideas. This is a direct assault by Jesus on the military regime of the Roman Empire. The sending of the pigs into the sea has similarities to the army of Pharaoh drowning in the Sea of Reeds in the Exodus story. Today we would call this a Plowshares Action, where Christian activists have done symbolic damage to military equipment to prophesy against the evils of the war economy we live in an effort to make space for healing and for life to flourish, just as Jesus has been doing here. Let's carry on the story from verse 14 now. The men looking after the pigs ran off and told their story in the city and country all about, and the people came to see what had really happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, the man who had had the legion in him, properly dressed and in his full senses. And they were afraid. And those who had witnessed it reported what had happened to the demoniac and what had become of the pigs. Then they began to implore Jesus to leave their neighbourhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed begged to be allowed to stay with him. Jesus would not let him and said to him, "Go home to your people and tell them all that the Lord in his mercy has done for you." So the man went off and proceeded to proclaim in the Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Just like the Capernaum episode, Jesus is confronted on his arrival by a scared demon. There is a verbal confrontation, powerful exorcism which brings amazement and publicity. With the demon dealt with, Jesus is then able to carry on his work of healing to the poor. Our veteran then and veterans today occupy some of the most disadvantaged places in our society as a result of their often traumatic work experiences. Psychologists are very open that oppression and hatred can generate mental illness, which is often just a cathartic response to incredible pain or prolonged subjugation. In our modern Western context, this is usually treated as an individual phenomenon. But Mark seems to be using this poor veteran as a symbol of a more public communal problem. His name, Legion, expresses some of the collective anxiety about the imperialism of Rome and its colonizing of minds as well as land. His internalized pain is causing him to harm himself while in the grip of a very strong power he cannot resist or throw off. In this episode, we see an example of Jesus taking on the powers and binding the strong man, which he spoke of when the scribes accused him of being demon-possessed a couple of chapters ago. In the synagogue, the strong man was identified with the scribal class. Today's text, it is the armies of Caesar that earn this title. In our modern world, who might earn that title today? Mark has been clear that despite the improbability of liberation from the burdens of the scribal class or the powers of Rome, the promise of the mustard seed growing into a large tree to provide shelter for small birds, the poor, was actually possible. Here was the man oppressed by the legion in his right mind and fully clothed. No wonder people were incredulous and amazed. But they were also afraid and wanted Jesus to leave their neighbourhood. Strange, you might think, when such a fantastic miracle had just occurred. The locals knew what hungry soldiers would be like now that their food had disappeared into the lake. It was not going to be pretty, and they didn't want Jesus making it any worse for them. Bugger off, get out of our sight, leave town. So with this exorcism, Mark has now broken through the symbolic power of the Roman military and repudiated it like he did with the scribes in Capernaum. Now the good news of the kingdom can be extended in its fullness to Gentiles as well. Mark's Jesus will continue to proclaim this kingdom as he continues crossing the lake and goes further down a road less travelled, a road he's invited us to join him on. Sean spoke last week about the lake crossing and the storm that blew up. If this story of Mark's is to be taken seriously and we follow the Jesus he proclaims to us, we will find ourselves being called to cross various socio-political boundaries. This is always a treacherous endeavour. My own journey from a mainstream European upbringing location to a non-Western Indigenous world has seen many storms blow up, from all quarters of the compass too. Many are put off the hassle of a journey like this, yet Jesus here leads us directly into those storms, and today we see the fruit of that effort. This is the call of discipleship, to wrestle with the questions and problems of loving our neighbour on the other side of whatever side there is. This story directly challenges a lot of the ways we as a church have operated in the Christendom era that thankfully now has passed. Every church still seems to have some sort of welcome sign and holds conferences in hui to inspire the congregation to reach out and bring in the harvest, to invite others to be like us and attend the activities of the church community. But that is not Mark's Jesus at all. Mark's Jesus is on the road, crossing the sea to the other side, and when he engages with Legion, he refuses to bring him back to the Jewish side of the lake. The restored veteran is left to live and tell of the goodness of God on that other side. So it was no surprise when Bono, in his tribute to Smithy at his funeral, wrote, "He was always on the other side of whatever side there was." A very perceptive insight into the way Smithy lived. John understood this story we have today in the depth of his being, not just intellectually. He lived it. Crossing to the other side is part of our DNA as God's Squad Christian Motorcycle Club. Allied with this idea about going to the other side, there was a quirky but very powerful song by Bob Dylan that Norm introduced to me when I was a young man. With God on Our Side, it is called, and it is well worth a listen. And it ends with the line, "With God on our side, He will start the next war." It is so easy to other those who are different or that we don't understand. It is not a huge step to then demonize them and eventually start going to war against them. Our gossip columns, media, smoko rooms, and even church halls are full of this reality. Going to the other side is where we meet those we demonize and dehumanize. In the process of asking someone on the other side, "Tēnā koe, there you are, who are you?" we begin the process of rehumanizing them and discovering our shared humanity, our solidarity together. Of course, this process is not easy. Foreign and unknown places can be daunting to us, and the others may view us with suspicion if we come with a superior attitude and think we know what they might need. Storms really do blow up, but the only way to break down the walls that the powers set up between us is to cross over them and dismantle them. Power is a very real force that ruins our collective lives. We see that portrayed here in the fragile life of Legion. He had given his all for the Empire's cause and received a ruined life in the tombs. It is into this impure social and religious context that Jesus takes his mates to bring healing and hope. In one moment, he exposes and undermines the brutality of military power and shows incredible care for a veteran deformed by that brutal power. This call to go to the other side is again a doorway to experiencing the good news of the kingdom of God. The good news that declares that the bad news of war and demonizing others is over. We actually can love God, love our neighbour, love ourselves, and see that mustard tree grow to provide shelter and hope to all who are oppressed. Mark's Jesus is walking on, calling us to follow closely. Next week there is another lake crossing with ongoing encounters that bring him to the attention of more power brokers. Stay tuned and stick with us as we continue to walk with this Jesus and see how the story ends up. Rangamārie o te atua ki a tātou katoa. Cheers, and may the peace of God be with us all.